Hi everybody. So this presentation is to walk you through the analysis of variance on the data set and the experimental design that's going to be the basis of this first paper, although you won't be writing the results up as part of the paper, although I'll ask you to do that later. I think understanding these results allow you to think more clearly about uh, implications of your two independent variables and how you're going to discuss this in your introduction. So we have two independent variables. They're both Big Five personality test variables, neuroticism and extraversion. The dependent variable is labeled here as para 1. It's the dependent variable is the Tobichek and Milford paranormal belief scale. And the range on that scale is basically goes from as if a person had answered 1 on each of the ratings, and that would be the minimum number. And the maximum score would be if a person had answered 5 on every question, but they didn't. And so we've got this range that the dependent variable can move as a function of these two independent variables. Okay, so the important thing here is we're going to be looking at main effects, and we're going to be looking at an interaction, and we're going to be looking at paired comparisons. Some statistics that we'll be talking about are the F values, since an analysis of variance is also basically a series of F tests. We'll be looking at the P values, which gives us the probability of making a type 1 error. And we'll also need to be concerned about what's called the degrees of freedom when we write up the results of this. What you're looking at now is called the ANOVA table. It captures both independent variables and the interaction. And so if we take a look at the first row here, this BFI N stands for neuroticism, and this is the main effect of neuroticism. The F value for the main effect of neuroticism is 4.5. The P level is 0.036. We'll not worry about lambda and power. Likewise, row 2 is the main effect for extraversion. The F on that is less than 1, and the P is 0.8. And this third row is the interaction term. And so when you see two variables like this, N asterisk E or N X E is in the title of this slide, that's referring to an interaction of those two variables. And for the interaction, we see that there's an F of 2.7 and a p-value of 0.09. So let's talk about what value of p one needs in order to decide whether or not the effect of an independent variable or the interaction should be considered reliable. If you remember, that's called the alpha level, and that's something that an experimenter decides. What we're going to do here is we're going to treat any p-value that's less than 0.1 as reliable. Generally, anything that's 0.05 or smaller is considered reliable, and in between 0.05 and 0.1 is what's called marginally reliable. And so this 0.09 qualifies as marginally reliable. Okay, so what we see here then is that there appears to be an effect of neuroticism, but not of extraversion. But we do have an interaction here. So with that in mind, let's take a look at the main effects. So these two tables represent the means for the main effects. In this first table, we have neuroticism, and in the second table, we have extraversion. So this is the effect for neuroticism. Low N, high N. Low N refers to stable personality. High N refers to neurotic personality. The count refers to how many subjects were in each of those groups, and these are the means. And so the mean paranormal belief score for stable personality people was 62, and the mean paranormal belief score for people who were neurotic is 69. And that we can see in the previous slide was reliable at 0.03. So this difference between 62 and 69 is reliable, and we can see that people who are neurotic score higher on paranormal beliefs than people who have a more stable personality. If we look down here for the main effect for extraversion, if you recall in the previous slide, that wasn't a reliable effect, and we can basically see that here where we've got a mean of 66 and 65. This low refers to people who are introverted. High refers to people who are extroverted. All right, so there's no difference here and a reliable difference with neuroticism. Okay, let's take a look at our next slide. So what I want to do now is to have the TA pause this, and during this pause, I want people to make a figure for each main effect. So that'll be a figure for the neuroticism effect and a figure for the extroversion effect. So we'll pause now, and I'll come back after you've made your figures. Okay, great. Welcome back. So presumably you've discussed these figures and you're fine with that, and we can move on to the next step, which is making another figure. And that's a figure of the interaction. Before we do that, let's make sure we understand this table though. This is the means table for the interaction. We can see that it's an interaction by having the two independent variables listed here. And what you see here are the four means, and the count is the number of subjects in each cell of the design with the accompanying standard deviations. So let's take a look at what we mean by low N and low 1. Low N refers to neuroticism. This one, unfortunately labeled as 1, refers to extroversion. So low N and low 1 refers to people who have stable personalities and who are introverted. Low N is still stable personality, but now we're looking at extroverted people. Low N, high 1 is stable people who are extroverted. And on the bottom two rows, we're now looking at subjects who scored high on neuroticism, and high N, low 1 are people who are neurotic and introverted, and people who are in this cell labeled high N are neurotic, and high 1 means extroverted. So that's what these labels mean, and these 4 means are what you need to use to plot your interaction. So let's pause right now, and everybody makes a figure of the interaction, which means you need to put one of the independent variables on the x-axis. And I'll pause now, make your figures, and come back and we'll discuss them. Welcome back. So everybody's got a figure, and let's go to the next slide. And the important thing to realize is that there's actually 2 ways to make a figure of an interaction that has 2 independent variables. This is one way, and what we see in this slide is the means table for the interaction replicated in the upper left, and we've plotted neuroticism on the x-axis, and the extraversion variable is labeled on the interior. And so notice that the range of values that we have represented with the subjects who did this test ranges from 60 to 73. And so what I've done here, and keep in mind that this figure is not legitimate APA style, but the scores on the dependent variable range from 60 to 80. And so what we have here are the 4 means from the table in the upper left, and I've labeled them as extroverted and introverted, and that's one way to make this figure. The other way to make it is to put the extroversion variable on the x-axis, and that's what we see in this next slide. So now we have introversion, extroversion labeling the 2 levels of the independent variable, and we have neurotic and stable type of personality on the interior labeling these 4 means. Now, either way is fine. However, it's likely that you're going to find, and this is typically the case, one figure that's easier to describe. Keep in mind that the whole point of a figure is to facilitate the description of your results to the reader. And generally, a figure is a much more effective way of doing that than just a paragraph describing it. And so, to me, this figure is nice because, and we'll have to look at the paired comparisons to know for sure, but one way to describe this is that there's not an effect of neuroticism for introverts. However, with extroverts, we see that people who are neurotic extroverts have more of a belief in the paranormal than extroverts with stable personalities. This figure where neuroticism is on the x-axis describes the same thing, except with this crossover interaction like this, I think it's a little more confusing. Either way, though, is correct. If it were me, I would go with this figure. Okay, which brings us to the paired comparisons. So we've looked at 2 main effects, and a main effect is the effect of one independent variable, and we've looked at the interaction. So here's the thing to keep in mind when you look at an interaction figure like this. We know there's an interaction. It's reliable at 0.09. But all that F tells us is that there's an interaction. The F for the interaction does not tell us which of these four means differ from each other. For that, we need paired comparisons. And a paired comparison is called a paired comparison because it's an F test for a pair of means. And so if we take a look at this first paired comparison, what we see is that we have this inclusion variable, neuroticism low, and if we look at this next one, we see that the inclusion criteria is high neuroticism. The variable that this F represents is extraversion. So what we see here is that there's, with this p-value of 0.21, that there's not a reliable effect of extraversion for people who are high in neuroticism. That's only for people who are high in neuroticism. So where on the figure are we looking at? We're only looking at people who are high on neuroticism, and so that would be these two data points labeled with an N for neurotic, as opposed to the people who scored low on neuroticism, who are represented by the S's for stable. So neuroticism high, there's not an effect of extraversion, and that means that this mean for neurotic and introvert does not reliably differ from the mean for neuroticism for extroverts. So there's not a difference here. What's this other one telling us? It's also for extroversion, but only for the subjects who scored low in neuroticism, which is the stable personality. So we look over here at the F and the P. The P is 0.27. That's almost 3 times as large as our 0.09, which was at the far end of marginal in the first place. And so we don't have an effect there. What means are we looking at? We're looking at the two S's, the stable. The inclusion criteria is people who scored low on neuroticism, which is stable. And so what this top paired comparison tells us is that the people who are stable personality but introverts did not score any differently than people who were stable and extroverts. So that's what that is telling us. Now there's other comparisons to make, and what we need to take a look at is when the inclusion criteria is for the two levels of extroversion, and that's in the next slide. We just finished looking at the effect of extroversion with people who scored low on neuroticism and high on neuroticism. In this last set of paired comparisons, we're looking at the effect of neuroticism for people who scored low on extroversion and people who scored high on extroversion. So if we look at this first paired comparison, we're looking at subjects who scored low on extroversion, in other words, the introverts. And is there effect of neuroticism for people who scored low on extroversion? So we're taking a look here at people who scored low on extroversion, which would be the introverts, and we're seeing if there's an effect of neuroticism. And so that comparison, that p-value of 0.76, is the p-value for the N and the S at the level of introversion, right here. There's not a difference here, not a reliable difference, and that's what visual inspection would suggest. Now let's take a look at the second paired comparison. These are for people who only scored high on extroversion. So it's the extroverts. This paired comparison is telling us whether or not there's a reliable difference between neurotic and stable personality types who are extroverts. And with a p-value of 0.0049, an F of 9, we can see that there is a reliable difference. And so it's only for extroverts, so we're looking at the right two data points, the neurotic and the stable people who are extroverted. And there is a reliable difference. So of the 4 paired comparisons we've looked at, only one of them is reliable. And that's the effect of neuroticism for extroverts, these right 2 points here. So we have 4 paired comparison. We have 2 main effects, and we have an interaction. So what that means is that there's 7 F tests that go into a results section. And these Fs determine which ones you can describe as reliably different or not. And so the best way to do this is to present 2 main effects, then the interaction, and then the paired comparisons. We'll talk more later about how to actually write up a results section. It's actually rather formulaic. There's not a lot of ways to write up a results section for something like this. But what's important right now is to just understand whether or not the hypotheses that you have made ended up being validated by the results that we obtained. And so with that, I will let the TA take over things here. And